Добрый вечер. Спасибо за терпение. Спасибо вам за то, что пришли. Это очень радует.
Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for your patience. Thank you to the Garage Contemporary Arts Museum. My name is Michael Bird. I represent the Embassy of the UK and the British Council. Today we continue our cycle of lectures dedicated to cultural leadership. As you know, 6 months ago, I wrote 10 letters to one of the leading cultural representatives of the UK, and they all responded, they all came back to me, they all accepted my invitation. And now they're visiting Russia, Moscow, St. Petersburg, and I'm exceptionally glad. Tonight we have Dr. Tristram Hunt, the director of the Victoria and Albert Museum. Victoria and Albert Museum is one of the leading museums of art and design in the world. Dr. Hunt has been the director of the museum for the last 2 years. It's a period of very intensive growth for the UK and across the world. Dr. Hunt is known as an ex-MP, as the Shadow Minister of Education, who's authored 3 books, including Friedrich Engelsee. Well, enough from me. I'm so exceptionally glad that he's here with us tonight. Let's welcome him.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It's a great pleasure to be with you this evening at the Garage Education Centre, and it's a great privilege to be hosted by the Garage Centre, which is doing such important work in terms of spreading understanding about art and culture and contemporary art. I also want to thank the British Embassy in Moscow for inviting me here this evening. Their work in terms of ensuring a really strong and creative British-Russian cultural dialogue, whatever the circumstances, seems particularly valuable and important. And over the last couple of days, I've been made to feel incredibly welcome here in Moscow by a range of cultural institutions. So what I want to talk about this evening is the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Civic and the Global. I want to explore the history and meaning and purpose of the VNA and its contemporary ambitions, which are both very germane, I think, to the state of Britain as it is today, but also our global responsibilities. The VNA, as many of you will know, is a museum born of the mid-19th century and is what we regard as the world's leading museum of art, design and performance. We welcome 4 million visitors a year across our sites. We are the holders of the national collections of the art of photography, ceramics, glass, fashion, the print, jewelry, and at the heart of our core is a notion of ingenuity and imagination. That, as I'll explain, we came into being not as a traditional art gallery where you retreat from the world in a sense of the sublime. We came into the world to encourage enterprise, ingenuity, manufacturing, innovation, design, and our collections always have this quite functional purpose behind them. So as you think of the V&A, don't think of it in the sense of a traditional museum or art gallery. We always had this very functional, almost utilitarian purpose behind our foundation. And we also have within our collections an extraordinary range of wonders from this great country. Russian objects can be seen in the V&A galleries. Of course, we have some wonderful collections of Fabergé in our jewellery galleries. Although having seen the Kremlin collection today, I'm reimagining our role. We're proud to have a marble bust of Catherine II in our Europe galleries, where I think she would like to be. And we have a Golovin-designed costume for Boris Godunov in our theatre and performance galleries, as well as these superb silver gilt gates from Kiev. As I'll explain, we've always had a very, very powerful and prominent exhibition schedule at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And again, I'm proud to say that Russia features prominently in many of our exhibitions. Most recently, the exhibition Opera, Power, Passion and Politics, which included a major section on Shostakovich's Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk district. And we were very grateful for loans from the Tretyakov for that. But over recent years, we've also been proud to put on exhibitions the treasures of the royal courts, part of which was at the Kremlin Museum, telling the story of the Tudors, the Stuarts, and the Russian Tsars, as well as an exhibition on Russian avant-garde theatre, war, revolution, and design, 1913 to 1931. We also ensure that our collections come here to Russia, touring exhibitions, most recently the Julia Margaret Cameron photography exhibition, which came here in 2014, part of the UK-Russia Year of Culture. We had another exhibition on Shakespeare, on shooting Shakespeare, and the Jamil Prize of Islamic Art, also travelling here to Russia. So we're very proud of our connections with Russia, our deep cultural partnership with many institutions here, and we look forward in the coming years to deepen those. But let me tell you a bit about life at the Victorian Albert Museum in South Kensington in London, because we are a living, breathing museum. Last year we sold 105,115 scones. And ladies and gentlemen, if you want a scone in London, there is no better place to come than the Victoria and Albert Museum. We practice yoga in our galleries. VNA yoga is the third most searched term on the VNA website. And here you can see them doing, I'm not a yoga, the downward dog, I imagine, in the Raphael galleries. And we have our own honey. The bees above South Kensington produce this beautiful, rather sweet honey because they like the lychees in the Chinese ambassador's garden. And this produces a certain texture, but it's very, very popular. And as Michael said, 2 years ago, I resigned as a Member of Parliament for Stoke-on-Trent Central to take up the post of Director of the Victoria and Albert Museum. Some asked at the time what possible experience I could bring, having worked in a vast Victorian edifice surrounded by gnarled historical artifacts. But somehow the experience of Westminster has also brought insights into running a museum. Although I didn't really understand politics until I started working with museum curators, who really are the ones who know what politics are about. But the difference is this, that I always felt that working in Westminster, there was this very strong sense of the past, a very strong sense of nostalgia, of being held victim by the past. And now I work in an institution which has a collection stretching back 5,000 years, 2.3 million objects celebrating the past. And I find much less nostalgia. I find a much stronger focus on the future. I find a much more rigorous and scholarly engagement with the nature and meaning of the past, and a commitment by our curators to curate the future as much as manage the past. And that's, in a sense, why museums are such exciting and wondrous places, in that, yes, we deal in the artifacts of the past. We deal with some of the world's greatest items of human creativity and ingenuity, but we're not captured by the past. We're always thinking about how we interpret and reinterpret that for the present. So let me say something about the origins of the Victoria and Albert Museum. There's a common joke in London that the V&A houses all the items that can't go into the National Gallery or the British Museum. That we are, as someone called us, a refuge for destitute collections, or the nation's attic, or as one of my predecessors called it, a very capacious handbag. But in fact, we have some very, very clear origins. And the first of those is extra-European. The first of those is as the East India Company repository. The East India Company was the vehicle for British colonialism during the late 18th century. And part of the psychology of colonialism was also the psychology of collecting. And so, particularly in Bengal in the 1780s and 1790s, as the East India Company acquired more territory, so it also began to collect some of the beauties of South Asia and bring them back to London to establish what was called the East India Company Repository, which became the East India Company Museum, which became the India Museum, which became part of the South Kensington Museum, the V&A. And that's why we have an incredible collection of South Asian textiles and fabrics, one of the greatest in the world. And that's why we also have this wonderful treasure, which is known as Tipu's tiger. And Tipu's tiger was a symbol in many ways of the might of British colonialism. It was designed by Tipu Sultan, who was the great Muslim ruler of Mysore. He was the tiger of Mysore, and he stood out against British colonialism. And his children were taken captive by the British. And Tipu designed this toy for his children. And what it is an organ. And when you wind it up, the tiger growls, the British officer screams and raises his arm in pain as he's being decapitated. And so for Tipu, this was a symbol of resistance against the British, to tell his children to have faith. But when in 1799, Tipu Sultan was taken at the storming of Seringapatam and he dies, the tiger then is captured as a symbol of the British taking India, that the tiger itself is captured and is brought back to Britain. And people line the streets as Muscovites line outside museums today to see Tipu's tiger. And it became the readiest and most popular symbol of the might of British colonialism and forms now part of our museum. But what I particularly like about it is that it was designed in traditional Indian handicraft style. It depicts a British officer being decapitated, but the engineering for the organ was done by the French. So this is a story of late 18th century Franco-British Indian power relationships. So the first part of the story of the V&A is the story of the East India Company. The second is the story of the design school movement of the 1840s. Great Britain was the first to industrialize. The Industrial Revolution took off in the 1780s. But by the 1830s, there was this sense that Britain was falling behind France, America, Germany. And we needed to invest in design schools. And so right across the country, a series of schools were established to teach the principles of good design. And at the heart of them was the government school of design. And around the country, institutions like this were built to teach young people the importance of design. So the VNA began as a place to teach design. We've always had education and the importance of education, like Garage, right at the heart of what we do. The growth of our collections, the growth of our galleries, our role nationally and internationally was always focused on this educational component. And the third part of our foundation lies with good Prince Albert. Albert, the consort of Queen Victoria, was in many ways a radical figure. He was impatient with the self-satisfaction, the arrogance of the British landed elite. And he thought that Britain was living on past glories, and that if it wanted to succeed in the mid-19th century, if it wanted to succeed in the 1840s and 50s, it had to support design and innovation and manufacturing and technology. And he brought around him a series of radical figures who supported the establishment of new institutions. And one of these was the great architect of the Dresden Opera House, Gottfried Semper, who fled Europe in 1848, after the revolutions, found refuge at the court of Prince Albert and supported the establishment of museums and public institutions. He called museums the true teachers of a free people. And he thought that, yes, museums needed to teach design and technology, but what they also had to do was teach citizenship. And if during the course of the 19th century, the vote was going to be extended to the working classes, then it was the role of museums and public institutions to educate our future masters. And museums had this important civic function. So that civic role of teaching democracy and citizenship to a future working class electorate was there at the beginning as well. So we had all these ideas, the East India Company, education, teaching citizenship. But there was one man who had to bring it together. And Prince Albert's terrible pun was that if you need steam, get coal. And this is our first director of the V&A, Sir Henry Cole. And to my mind, this is what a director of the V&A should look like. And Henry Cole was one of these great mid-Victorian, energetic, entrepreneurial figures who did so much to ensure that the British state and British creativity found a voice. He was the leading figure behind the 1851 Great Exhibition of Industry of All Nations. This was this remarkable exhibition which took place on Hyde Park beneath a glass and steel crystal palace designed by Joseph Paxton, within which all of the industry, the most advanced technology from around the world was put on display. And we tend to think of this in Britain as the moment when Britain celebrated its role as workshop of the world, as Disraeli called it, the height of our imperial and commercial might. But really, it was a testament to fear and nervousness, because what it indicated, again, was that Britain was falling behind. That when the manufacturers and industrialists of Britain saw what the French, the Germans, the Americans, the Russians were producing, there was this sense of the loss of a competitive edge. So even as it was celebrated in terms of sort of British self-regard, there was also this looming fear about decline. But interestingly, this figure, who is a non-British, a Chinese figure, there at the great height of the Great Exhibition, there in the front row at the beginning in 1851. And it was interesting, as we'll come back to see in terms of the history of the V&A, that Mr. Xi Sheng, who arrived in London only a few months earlier on his boat, the Kei Ying, which was one of the first to go up the Thames, was invited to be at the beginnings of the Great Exhibition. The Great Exhibition was an enormous financial success. And out of it came a conviction that we shouldn't lose the energy, that Britain shouldn't lose the display of industrial creativity which was put on display in that summer of 1851. So the ambition was that with the profits of the Great Exhibition, a new cultural campus would be created, a new cultural quarter would be built, which would become to be known as Albertopolis. That the Royal College of Music, the Royal College of Art, the Royal Albert Hall, in time the Science Museum, the Natural History Museum, Imperial College, this body of land south of Kensington Palace, where Victoria and Albert lived, which became known as South Kensington, would build up this first creative space to take forward these ideas from the Great Exhibition. And at the heart of it would be what was called the South Kensington Museum. And this is the first frontispiece of the V&A. And at the top of this wonderful Italianate design, we see a pediment celebrating the Great Exhibition, and industry stretching out its arms. So inside this building would be housed some of the great fruits of 1851, and it was hoped over time build up a broader collection. This is our recently opened new entrance to the museum on Exhibition Road, and the reason why I highlight this now is that because it brings back that idea of Albertopolis. What we've done is open the museum onto the street in an incredibly fluid and open way. We've built here, we think, the largest porcelain tile courtyard in the world, which is an incredibly inviting civic space. And the fear always in South Kensington was that the institutions would build up the walls and not cooperate and not collaborate between themselves, turn their backs to Exhibition Road, which flows along here. And what we've hoped to do in our new entrance to the V&A is celebrate that spirit of Albertopolis, celebrate that civic spirit of what a museum is for, that museums as these open, civic, accessible spaces which belong to all, in which everyone has this democratic right to participate. And right from the start of the museum, there was a different ethos to the South Kensington Centre. Here we have the Morris Room. Today, as we see around us, every museum has a wonderful cafe and restaurant. Well, the South Kensington Museum was the first to do this, to ensure that families and working people could enjoy themselves coming to experience the collections and the galleries. And what the museum also did, and here you see some of the old plaster casts, which I'll come to, is introduce gas lighting so that working people could come and visit the museum after work. And when we look at the visitor figures for who came during the day and who came after work. We see an incredible number of working people visiting the museum in the 1870s and 1880s, that there was this sense of a democratic birthright to it. Initially, the museum was free 4 days a week, and then paid entry 3 days a week for scholars and students. And then, just over 100 years ago, during the battle for the female vote, the battle for the female suffrage, the suffragettes, the campaigners for the female vote, one of their campaigning tools was to go and break and slash great works of art, like the Rokeby Venus. And so the response of the VNA to that was to introduce free entry for all, because they felt that crowded public galleries would have less risk of items being damaged by suffragettes. So it was another great step forward from the suffrage movement. But interestingly, one of the first exhibitions which the museum put on was known as the Chamber of Horrors. And it was an account of what not to have in your home. It was an account of the most vulgar products produced by British designers. And the museum, as a museum of art and design, felt it had this responsibility to tell people what not to buy. That as domestic life grew, as expendable income advanced, and people were going to fill their homes with lace and terrible table lamps where the gas light came out of the convolvulus, that a museum as a place of art and design had this responsibility in telling people what not to buy. It would be a brave museum today, I tell you, which did an exhibition telling people what was good and bad taste. But in those days, there was no such constraint. What's interesting from an international perspective is how many sought then to follow the lead of the Victoria and Albert Museum. And so in Vienna, the museum, the MAC, the Museum of Applied Arts, was created in direct imitation of the South Kensington Museum. And in America, in Philadelphia, after the 1876 exhibition, they too created a museum of applied and decorative arts. And so this notion of the museum helping to teach design and innovation through its collection, this focus on showcasing ingenuity in order to spark imagination, proved incredibly popular. So during the second half of the 19th century, from the 1850s and 60s onwards, the collection of the V&A began to grow. And one of the most important additions to the collection were these, the Raphael Cartoons. The Raphael Cartoons were drawn by Raphael for Pope Leo X for a series of tapestries for the Vatican, which were then woven in the Netherlands. King Charles I of England buys them in the 1620s in order to build up a tapestry industry in Britain, and they then remain part of the royal collection up until the present day. And these were regarded as the most important items within the collection of art within Britain. Every student studied the Raphael Cartoons. They were the greatest works of the High Renaissance. And in 1863, Queen Victoria decided to donate, to lend the cartoons to the new museum in South Kensington. And this was the great symbol of approbation, so that every student of art and design could come to the museum and sketch them. And here you see, on the top left, the cartoons being loaded up from Queen Victoria's palace at Hampton Court in these great wooden cases and being taken to South Kensington. And recently, we took the frame, the glass frame, off the cartoons to check them. And what's amazing is the colour hasn't deteriorated in 500 years. But also what's so interesting is that we're still using the same technology. This casing seems to me eminently similar to what was used back in the 1860s. And today you can see these cartoons in the Raphael Gallery. And during the course then of the 1870s, 1880s, the collection grows. We build up a very, very impressive collection of Islamic art. One of the great discoveries of the great exhibition and later was the wonder of Islamic design. And so Owen Jones, who's a big figure, a big designer within our history, persuades the museum to collect Islamic art. And here we have one of our great treasures, which is the Ardabil carpet, which William Morris, the great socialist and aesthete, convinced the director to buy. The Chinese collection grows, the Korean collection, the Japanese collection, as Japan opens up in the 1890s, so the collection grows, teaching again and again the nature of design. And you begin, though, to get this interesting tension between the founding idea of the museum to promote design and technology, and the demands of curators who are more and more drawn to acquiring beautiful sculpture and paintings and fine arts. And particularly there are these trips to Italy in the 1870s, which come back with these wonderful works of sculpture, hugely expensive, which the director's tearing his hair out at, saying, this isn't true to the museum. And the curators say, yes, 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 but don't they look beautiful? And so the collection builds up in all sorts of idiosyncratic ways. But we've always had this tension between the demands of a collection, which in and of itself are wondrous and beautiful, and that focus on ensuring education and design is at the heart of it. Henry Cole also thought that the museum should be at the forefront of technological change. He never wanted the VNA to be a place just to retreat into the past. The VNA was one of the first museums to hold a photography exhibition. He was enormously excited by the new technologies around photography, electrotyping, and crucially, plaster casts. And what he does in 1867 is draft a convention for reproduction of works of art. And he urges the leading princes and principalities and nations of Europe and Russia to come together to agree to share their collections for the purposes of reproduction, so that working people across the world who did not have the capacity to travel could go and see for themselves some of the wonders that were there around the world. And so we have within our galleries extraordinary examples of reproductions. You will know this wonderful Leopard, which was, very good history this, sold to Russia in the 1620s. An electrotype is then taken of it to bring back to the Victorian Albert Museum, where it guards our silver galleries. And of course, the original sits in the Kremlin Museum now. It's a rather good example, I think, of British-Russian cooperation. Similarly, another wonder from the Kremlin Museum, but also a wonder from the Hermitage from St. Petersburg. This culture of copying, of course, finds its greatest display in our plaster cast courts. Like the Pushkin, we have this incredible, almost sublime space for the reproduction of the great works of art, so that working people in London who couldn't go to Rome or Naples or Florence could come and, as they said, travel round the world in the heart of South Kensington. And here you see our Trajans Column split into two. This is in better shape than the original one in Rome. It hasn't suffered the same levels of pollution. And so scholars who want to understand the rule of Emperor Trajan now come to look at the one in the Victoria and Albert Museum rather than go to Rome. So again, this was this sense of the democracy, the civic function of the museum, opening up these collections to working people. So what of the museum today? How do those ideas affect how we run it today? To stay alive, a museum has to grow its collections. And one of our more controversial recent acquisitions is a two-story block from a brutalist housing estate being knocked down in East London. One of the great collecting themes in our museum are historic rooms. So as the great houses, townhouses of London, for example, were knocked down in the 1930s, the VNA purchased whole rooms and rebuilt them. And so we have great 18th century rooms, we have great 16th century rooms, we have a wonderful office designed by Frank Lloyd Wright in its entirety. And here we saw the chance to acquire a flat designed by the Smithsons, one of the great pieces of brutalist architecture. And we got in terrible trouble from both the cultural left and the cultural right for making this acquisition. The cultural right, the conservatives, said, well, this was just a total waste of money. What are you doing wasting your energy on such a hideous piece of architecture which deserves to be ripped down? And we weren't so concerned by that because we think for the long term, and in 50, 100, 150 years, people might well admire this. And then the radical left said, what are you doing acquiescing, supporting the destruction of social housing? That by the act of acquisition, we were involved in sanctifying the demolition of social housing. And so it became this notion, this is going to test our translating skills, the notion of art washing, that cultural institutions are somehow involved in supporting gentrification through acquisitions and interventions. And this was part of the controversy. Other more recent acquisitions. This is the world's first 3D printed gun, which came into our collections, part of our rapid response collecting team. This is the Burkini, which came into our collection in 2001. And this item, not necessarily my favorite, is a T-shirt celebrating the great influence of Jeremy Corbyn from a street stall in Bristol. So contemporary collecting and the interface between the contemporary and the historic is very important to the museum. But like many institutions that I've been talking to here in Moscow, we are also growing, and our future is partly connected to a multi-site future in the coming years. At our heart is the South Kensington Museum. We have the the Museum of Childhood in Bethnal Green in East London, which has been there since 1872. And then in Stratford, in East London, we're about to create 2 new facilities. The first is this, which is a collections and research centre. We have a vast reserve storage facility, which is held in West London, which is pretty much inaccessible to the public. And museums across the world come under a great deal of criticism for the amount held in storage relative to the amount on display. And so what we hope to do in the future is, like many institutions, open up our storage for public access so that you will be able to wander through the V&A reserve collections. And whether it's sculpture, whether it's fashion, whether it's photography, whether it's some of our historic rooms, you will be able to see and experience these for yourself. We will be rebuilding, for example, that Frank Lloyd Wright office in East London so people can experience it. And secondly, we're creating a new museum together with the Smithsonian Institution from Washington as part of a new cultural quarter in East London. The balance of cultural justice in London has always been slightly skewed, and West London is much better provisioned than East London. But the way in which London managed to win hosting the 2012 Olympics was always about the legacy, that the legacy of 2012 had to improve the life chances of people in the most diverse and the most disadvantaged boroughs in Britain. And the V&A now is part of being true to that mission. Alongside Sadler's Wells, the BBC, and other institutions, we're part of a new cultural quarter in Stratford, in the East End of London, to ensure that some of our great riches are shared much more widely. And what we hope to pursue with the Smithsonian Institution is taking a look at some of the big historic and contemporary themes that confront the world today and pursuing them in a thematic way through our galleries. That the ability to combine our collections with the Air and Space Collection from Washington, or the Museum of African American History and Culture, or the Museum of American Art, bringing that together in East London provides a really exciting opportunity. The other component of our multi-site operation in the UK is VNA Dundee. This opened in September. This fabulous designed museum of Scottish design on the banks here of the River Tay, designed by the Japanese architect Kengo Kuma, who is himself designing the Tokyo Olympic Stadium. It's modelled on the scraggy granite cliffs of northeast Scotland. And so this concrete and sandstone is meant to bring to mind that geography of the northeast. Dundee is a city that was once a great booming industrial, trading, commercial entrepot and has now fallen on hard times. And part of our purpose to be in that community is to ensure regeneration and growth, but also tell the story of Scottish design, of how Scotland influenced design right around the world, and how in turn global influences reached Scotland and Dundee. And I'm delighted that it opened in September, and we've had 400,000 visitors since then, in a city of 150,000 people. So everyone's been at least twice, and they're going to have to keep coming. The final part of our multi-site at the moment are these galleries in the Chinese city of Shenzhen. Shenzhen is just outside Hong Kong. It's part of the Pearl River Delta, a small fishing village of 30,000 people, 25 years ago, now a mega city of 13 million people. But it's also a UNESCO design city. And the reason why we're there is that as China moves from thinking about made in China to designed in China, as China moves, as Britain did in the 1840s and 50s, from an economic model based upon low labor costs, subsidized energy costs, to thinking about the importance and value of design, then an institution like the VNA seems a natural fit. And we've been delighted to work there. We're there for a few years. We'll see how it works. There's a permanent gallery telling the story of the values of design, but also the chance to take some of our traveling exhibitions. So, ladies and gentlemen, things are going very well, and we can see no problems on the horizon. Apart from one. As you know, Britain made the decision in 16, to leave the European Union. And because I'm partly here with the British Embassy in Moscow, the great opportunities that arise from that are not to be forsaken. But Brexit happened for a reason, and I was a member of Parliament in a community in the Midlands which voted very strongly to leave the European Union. And when you look at the map of how people voted, the red is where everyone voted to leave. And the blue is where they voted to remain. And you will see that the metropolitan parts of England voted to remain. London, Cambridge, Oxford, Brighton, Bristol, university metropolitan towns. Scotland voted to remain. Northern Ireland voted to remain. But non-metropolitan parts of England, regional parts of England, voted extensively to leave. And when you see these figures, the East and West Midlands, so the heart of England, it's not even close. It's 60-40 to leave the European Union. And part of that was a story about disconnection from London. Part of that was a sense that leading institutions, be it politics in Westminster, the media at the BBC, finance in the City of London, or cultural institutions, the Opera House, the British Museum, the VNA, were not speaking to the country as a whole, that there was this disconnect between the metropolitan areas and the non-metropolitan areas. And that anger was expressed in many ways through the vote to leave the European Union. So our response to that at the VNA is to go back to our founding mission, to go back to that idea of teaching design. And so we've begun a program over the last few years of sharing our collections, as many museums do, with regional galleries, but crucially, teaching design and technology to 15 and 16-year-olds. So we are supporting new qualifications. We are training teachers. We are working with business and galleries and schools to teach design in parts of the country which have felt the impact of deindustrialization, which have felt the impact of real change over the last 10 to 15 years. Communities which have lost their coal industry, their steel industry, their ceramics industry, and to revive our founding mission as a museum of design and for design. And it's great that this is beginning to have an impact. The second area I wanted to touch upon for what we're wrestling with as a museum is about the question of digital reproduction. You will remember this, our Convention on the Works of the Reproduction of Art by Henry Cole in 1867. Well, in an era of 3D printing, of digital scanning, of drone footage, what is our modern convention for the ethical and moral parameters for reproduction? When we reproduce an item from the Kremlin Museum and acknowledge where it came from and tell the story of it, how do we think today about a 3D print of the destroyed Arch of Palmyra? Does everyone have the right to this data? Does everyone have the right to reproduce artifacts which for some communities might have spiritual and an emotional significance? Do we have the right to download Native American religious artifacts which are on the web at the Smithsonian and produce them ourselves? So what we've sought to do with many institutions in Russia, in China, in France, America, around the world, is produce a new declaration, the Reach Declaration, thinking about what should be the moral and ethical system for thinking about that today. And it also throws up some interesting history of art conundrums. This is my favorite example. That you will know the wedding feast at Cana by Veronese, one of his great works produced for the San Giorgio monastery in Venice. Napoleon's troops turn up and rip it from the walls and carry it back to the Louvre. After the fall of Napoleon, the monks at San Giorgio write to the director of the Louvre and say, "Can we have it back now, please?" And the director of the Louvre says, "I'm sorry, it's far too fragile to travel." And so what one of the great digital sort of entrepreneurs of our day did, Adam Lowe from Factum Arte, was he did a digital reprint of the wedding feast. And he put it in the original place. He put it in the refectory, where it was originally commissioned for. Here is the one in the Louvre with the selfie sticks, and you'll see what's extraordinary about this is that they're actually looking at it, because most people look at the other end of the museum, of the gallery, where the Mona Lisa is. So here they're looking at it, and here is the digital reprint in its original location. Which is the original? Where is the aura, as Walter Benjamin would have put it? And did Adam Lowe have the right to put it back in the place from whence it was once taken? Is this a source of democracy and excitement, or are there ethical and moral principles we should be wrestling with around this? Finally, when we think about the rights to some of the museum collections and some of the ethical and moral questions of today, as I said, the V&A was born of the colonial and the imperial moment in Britain, and part of our collections today were taken from parts of the British Empire or acts of British colonialism. Amongst the most celebrated are our Magdala treasures, which were taken in 1867 from Magdala Fortress after its storming by British troops and the death of Emperor Theodore II. They were taken by the British Army, they went into the hands of the British government, and then they were dispersed between the British Museum, the British Library, and ourselves at the South Kensington Museum. At the time they entered our collection, William Gladstone, the Prime Minister, said these should not be part of the collections of museums. But our trustees are not allowed to what we call deaccession, to get rid of any items of the collection. because in the past, we've got rid of wonderful items which then future generations have regretted. But in Ethiopia, they're desperate to have these items back. We want to lend them to them, but they quite rightly say, hold on, we don't want to borrow what we think was taken from us. And so we're now involved in this conversation, which hopefully will work itself out, about exchange and partnership and curatorial and conservation relationship, which in the next few years hopefully will see these items go back to Addis Ababa on a long-term loan as part of a deep and complex relationship between ourselves and Ethiopia. We have other items from the colonial and imperial past, whether items from South Asia, from the storming of Seringapatam, or fewer and slightly more disputed provenance potential items from the burning of the Summer Palace. There's no doubt, and maybe we can discuss this further, that recent questions around provenance and colonial restitution and the report commissioned by Macron on the items in French holdings from sub-Saharan Africa has highlighted some of these challenges. But I'll end with a plea for the meaning and purpose of the museum, because at some levels it's complicated and challenging thinking about this colonial and global past. But the whole point of the museum is that it's cosmopolitan. The whole point of museums like the VNA and many others is that in an era when we're seeing more chauvinism, more parochialism, more nationalism, the role of museums are to be defenders of cosmopolitanism. The role of museums is to say that when you trace the history of art or the history of design, this is a story of complex and multiple interactions between peoples, identities, and traditions. And there is not, when you think about the items in our collection, a story of ethnic or national purity. And museums have that role of celebrating cosmopolitanism. What they also do is establish, I think, through the knowledge and wisdom and skill of the curators, foundations of deeper truth and knowledge. No museum is neutral, but in an era of social media and fake news and identity politics, the role of museums as arbiters of understanding becomes more important, not less. And finally, they have this role when we see politics becoming more divisive and more partisan and more angry. Museums have this civic role, the true teachers of free people. They have this civic role to be able to curate disagreement, to provide shared spaces for unsafe ideas, trusted arenas like the one we're in this evening, to think about complex and challenging and difficult ideas in an atmosphere of respect and understanding and tolerance. And I think those values are more important than ever at the moment. And that's why it's a privilege to be with you here this evening. Thank you.
Дорогие друзья, сейчас настало время для вопросов и ответов, наша традиционная часть каждого вечера. Пожалуйста, поднимите руки. Моя коллега с той стороны принесет микрофон, я с этой. Или Марина.
Hi. I'll try to do it in English, just sorry for that. I wonder, I'm here, just to the right.
Oh, very good, very good.
I just wonder if you, how do you form your collection now? And I wanted to ask you about contemporary works of traditional art that is vanishing, just some kind of very ancient things like illuminating and calligraphy. And do you collect contemporary pieces of these art?
So we have 5 main areas 5 departments. We have word and image, theatre and performance, furniture, textiles, fashion, sculpture, metalwork, ceramics, glass, and design, architecture, and digital. And all of those collect. And they collect modern as well as historic items. And one of our great relationships is with the Jamil family, and the Jamil Prize, for example, when it comes to calligraphy and thinking about contemporary art reflecting on the Islamic tradition, we've also taken into our collections art which came through the Jamil Prize, incredible calligraphy, which we've been proud to collect. So we collect both historic and contemporary right across the departments, and it's one of the many privileges of my job is to sit once a month in the collections group as we decide what we're going to go for and what we're not going to go for. But then we're always outbid, which is always frustrating. But we continue to collect. Does that answer your question? Good.
Hi.
Hi.
I want to ask, would you say that your museum shapes the tendency of art collecting in Britain and the world, maybe? Like, when you choose what to collect, as you said, when you choose that direction, do you think that also influences other museums' directions as well, and what people want to buy, for example? That's it.
That's a very good question. I think we are... I think over the long term, an intelligent and smart and committed curator can shape and mold a market over 5, 10, 15 years. And we were collecting digital art in the 1960s, and we've got a curator there who's really kind of shaped some of the thinking around that. And it's their job. I see the job of the curators who work at the VNA to have a real understanding of private and public collections and what's coming up and how to respond to that. But in reality, we are a minnow. I mean, we're a big museum, but if we spend over £1.5 million on acquisitions in a year, that's a big year. So compared to the world of contemporary art or modern art, compared to our colleagues at Tate or MoMA or here in Moscow, or let alone what's happening in the Gulf or China, we're not shaping the landscape today. We're confident about what we're doing because we know what we're about as an institution. But I think in today's world, we're much less significant than some of the bigger players who are out there, who are definitely shaping the market in remarkable ways, I think.
First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Hunt, for your fabulous presentation. I've been many times to Victorian Albert, and that's my favorite large museum in London, I should say. Also, thank you for presentation. I think that was the last exhibition that I saw from Victoria and Albert was in St. Petersburg a year ago, and it was a female underwear history exhibition that was really interesting, and also a modern exhibition. So my question to you is that I don't know whether that's your first time in Russia or not, but obviously you do you have some impressions, and my question is, you've mentioned that we have complex interaction between our countries, and what do you think is an epoch or period in British history that is mispresented, or you wish that would be more presented in a visual way? Also maybe meaning the artifacts that Victorian Albert has that would be more presented in Russia, will be presented in the nearest future. And on the opposite side, what do you think of the period of Russian history, or maybe the artifacts from the Russian museums that were not presented enough in the UK? Thanks.
Oh, what a very good question. This isn't my first trip to Russia. When I was last here, because I wrote when I was a historian, before I was a member of parliament, I wrote a biography of Friedrich Engels. And so when I was last here, I caught the midnight train from Moscow to Saratov. and then I went over the bridge to visit the city of Engels, which was an experience. But I very much enjoy Saratov. I think I mean the areas that we see in Britain, we see the age of as it were, the great heroic age of the Tsars, and so the exhibition I showed points to that, and we see a lot of the avant-garde. Which is interesting. What in a sense is more interesting, and we've been reflecting on this, and it might be sort of obvious, is in a sense that the marked exhibition in London in recent years on Russia was at the Royal Academy on the centenary of 1917, and thinking about the revolution, and in all its artistic and cultural manifestations, and the absence of that thinking here, and the absence of commemoration and engagement. And so, in a sense, when you have these challenging moments between countries, actually the other nation sometimes provides space to think about that nation's history. And so, you know, what would, in a sense, what would be the answer for Russia, for Russian institutions to think about Britain? I mean, we are wrestling endlessly, in a sense, with empire, Europe, and the nature of British identity. And so whether that's that sort of crucible moment of the 1890s and 1900s, which could be thought about here, I don't know. But I think there are great swathes of, I think, mid to late 19th century Russian history, which we could see much more of in London. It is, I mean, there's so much more our institutions can do together. And what's been wonderful in the last few days is to see what plans are in gestation and what we could assist with in the future. But it's, in a sense, it's interesting to always think which element a nation is not so keen to think about, which another nation can think about. I'm still a politician, I tell you.
Good evening. First of all, I would like to thank you for coming and to tell you that Victoria and Albert's Museum is one of the best museums in the world. I work with kids, and we take our groups of kids with their parents to your museum and to other London museums. And if you don't object, we would like to present you a little gift from our kids at the end, if I could come up to you. And the thing I wanted to ask, we saw that the museum presents certain exhibits that are not covered by glass, that are not hidden, perhaps that's done for people with poor vision. Who came up with this idea? How did it come about not to protect exhibits? Thank you.
I mean, some of the exhibits, you're absolutely right. The Catherine II bust and others are not protected by glass, but the vast majority of the items which are not protected are copies and reproductions. So we do have to, because of the insurance and environmental conditions, protect the vast majority of our artifacts are protected in the normal way. But I think the point about having visual aids for those who have problems with sight within the museum is so important. I was really impressed in the Pushkin by the aids for the Picasso Museum and understanding some of the Picasso works through touch. And there's no doubt, and I know Garage has led this conversation, that having museums as spaces for the disabled to access by right and sort of instinctively and naturally is so important. And we recently did an exhibition, and I know there's another one in Moscow, on Frida Kahlo, which was really focused on her disability and the story of her disability, along with her ethnicity and self-identity. And we worked very closely with disabled groups to ensure that their access to this exhibition, which was a story in many ways of disability, was designed from the very beginning of the exhibition. And it worked incredibly well, and it didn't take anything away from the experience of able-bodied. So this just becomes more and more natural within institutions, and we'll see more of it, which is quite right. But at the same time, we do still have these understandable barriers around protecting items of the collection.
Hello, thank you for the lecture. And my question is about where do you see... Oh, I'm here. Straight
there.
Where do you see the museum in the digital era that we live in now? Do you have or plan to have any online tours of the museum, of the permanent collections, and how it may influence the future of the museum and art in general? Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, the story of the VNAs, I hope I've been able to show, is about embracing technology and using technology to understand the past. And we're very passionate about digital provision. So 60% of our collection of 2.3 million objects is available online, with varying levels of image, but it's listed online. So being able to search the collection and use the collection digitally is incredibly important. And that's important for a museum which has items from around the world. So in South Asia or Burma or Korea, you can access the VNA collection digitally. We also, and we've got some great videos of this, you're able to understand much more about items under conservation, and whether it's Trajans Column or some of our textiles, and we put that up as well. We're not scared of this notion that the digital realm will undermine the physical realm. And all the indications are that the more you put online, the more people come through your doors. And when you put a particular item up on the website, people want to come and see it for themselves, because there's still something very, very powerful about the authentic and the original. There's this apocryphal study by New York University, which took a opinion poll which said that the Mona Lisa had been burnt to ashes, and you have a choice between going to see a perfect digital reprint of the Mona Lisa or going to stare at the ashes. And 80% go for the ashes. So that sense of human connection to the artifact and the object remains very, very powerful. So, I mean, the challenge with digital is it just costs so much money, and it's unending. And your digital officers come into your office and say, you know, if we don't do this, we're just doomed. And you go, oh God, okay, we've got to do that. So there's a kind of never-ending component to it, even as you understand the need for it. And in the future, you know, what we're seeing is the merging of our digital teams with all our other teams, because there's no, you know, whether it's marketing or education or conservation, the notion of having a separate digital team doesn't make sense when it's just so elemental to what we do today.
Hi, thank you for such a Right in the middle.
There you are.
Thank you for such a fascinating lecture. I just wanted to ask, you talked about museums being teachers of free people, and you touched on this a little bit when talking about Brexit. But how do you think that we can make museums more accessible, especially at a time when many view the cultural realm as very exclusive? How do you think that we can combat that, and how do you think we can make them more accessible to people of different classes and young people, etc.?
Well, I would be really interested to hear from Russian colleagues in the room this evening, whether the same debate takes place in Moscow to the same level. I mean, in Britain, this question, quite rightly, of reaching out to as wide a participation base as possible is absolutely fundamental to what museums are about today. Part of the success of Dundee in a tough part of the UK is that the museum, before it opened with neither a building nor a collection, did incredible amounts of work in local communities, in schools and colleges. So there was this sense of ownership about it. You also, it seems to me, have to reduce all of those barriers born of social class to coming into the museum. That the volunteers and the guides need to look and sound like members of the public who are coming in, that people have to feel, as Henry Cole wanted, a sense of right, that this is their space, all of this stuff belongs to me, I have a right to go and see it. And there are lots of ways, just in the management of the museum, you can do that. I think what you don't give an inch on is the curatorial rigor and the scholarship. And my view is you do everything you can on marketing, education, communications, the running of the museums, whilst retaining the excellence in terms of the scholarship and the curatorial lead. Because actually, I think that's what people admire about institutions. And that goes back to my point at the end, that if these are trusted and admired spaces, that level of knowledge and curatorial rigor has to be at the heart of them. I think we have big problems with the national museums in Britain, not so much around ethnic diversity within the London institutions, but more connection to non-metropolitan parts of England. And that's why our programme around education seems to me so important. But I'd be very interested to hear from Russian colleagues as to whether the same debate is taking place here in Moscow or Russia, whether there's the same level of anxiety about this as we definitely have in the UK.
И это хороший повод завершить.
And this is a good time to end the lecture, because if you have some questions and some time for discussion, at 9 o'clock we have to end. Let's thank our lecturer.